For 40 years, Agnes Morrow cleaned every inch of the Whitfield mansion. She knew every floorboard that creaked, every draft that slipped through the hallway after midnight, every crack the family never bothered to notice. But there was one room she was never allowed to touch. A door at the end of the east corridor, always locked, always silent. That room is not your concern. For 4 decades she accepted that. Then the family lost everything. The mansion was abandoned. The halls went dark. And on a cold morning in November, Agnes came back alone, stood before that door and opened it. What she found inside did not just explain the locked door, it explained her entire life. If this story reaches something real inside you, stay until the very end. And if you love stories about loyalty, hidden truth, and justice that arrives late but never too late, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Agnes started working at the Whitfield estate in the spring of 1983. She was 28 years old, recently widowed, with a 4-year-old son and no family left in the county willing to take her in. The job listing had been pinned to the board at the employment office in Barton, a small town at the base of the Shenandoah foothills in Virginia. Full-time housekeeper, room not included, references required. She had no references. She had cleaned motel rooms for 3 years, and before that had worked as a laundry assistant at a hospital in Roanoke. But she showed up at the estate gate on a Tuesday morning wearing the only good dress she owned, her son's hand in hers, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. The man who opened the front door was Edward Whitfield. He was in his early 60s then, tall, white-haired, slow in his movements but sharp in his eyes. He looked at Agnes standing on the stone steps with a child beside her and a face that showed no embarrassment, only the quiet endurance of someone who had already been through more than most people would tolerate in a lifetime. He did not ask for references. He asked her one question. "Can you keep a house the way it deserves to be kept?" Agnes answered, "I can keep it better than that." She began the next morning. The Whitfield estate sat on 42 acres of rolling Virginia hillside. The main house had 14 rooms, a formal dining hall with a chandelier that took Agnes an entire afternoon to clean, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, and enough windows to fill a week of steady work. Behind the house stood a stone carriage house, a greenhouse, and a garden that had once been formal but had long since grown wild with boxwood and climbing roses. Edward lived there with his 2 adult children. Charles, 36, handled the family's property investments and spent most of his time on the phone or driving to Richmond. Diane, 33, lived in the East Wing and painted watercolors that no one ever saw. Their mother had died 8 years earlier, and the house still carried their presence in the curtains she had chosen and the pale green wallpaper in the upstairs hall. Agnes cleaned 6 days a week. She arrived at 7 and left at 5. She swept, mopped, dusted, polished, scrubbed, laundered, and organized. She learned the rhythm of the house the way a musician learns a long piece of music. She knew which chairs Edward preferred, which rooms were used and which were not, the exact angle to set the library curtains so the morning light fell across his reading table without hitting his eyes. Edward treated her with consistent respect. He said good morning, he said thank you. Once, when Charles left a stack of dirty dishes on the dining table, clearly expecting Agnes to clean up, as though it were beneath him to carry a plate to the kitchen, Edward quietly told his son that this house runs because people care for it, and that people who care deserve to be treated as if they matter. Charles heard the words. He did not absorb them. From the beginning, there was the door. At the far end of the east corridor on the second floor, past Diane's painting room, past the linen closet, where the hallway light barely reached. Dark oak, a brass knob gone dull from disuse, always locked. In her first week, Agnes had tried the knob while working her way down the corridor with a dust cloth. It did not turn. She mentioned it to Edward that afternoon, asking whether he wanted her to clean inside. He paused before answering. "That room is private, Agnes. You do not need to go in there." She never asked again. Over the years, she dusted the doorframe, wiped the brass knob, swept the floor in front of it. but she never turned the handle again. Whatever was behind that door was not hers to know. The years moved slowly, and then all at once. Agnes watched Edward grow older in small, steady increments. His step became shorter. His hands developed a tremor he tried to hide by holding them behind his back. He stopped going to the greenhouse. He stopped reading in the library after dinner. By the mid-90s, he spent most of his time in the armchair by the window in the front parlor, looking out at the driveway as though expecting someone who never came. Charles, meanwhile, had taken full control of the family's finances. He brought partners into the property business. He refinanced the estate twice. He borrowed against the land. Agnes did not understand the details, but she understood the weight of the conversations she overheard through closed doors. The phone calls that grew louder. The visitors who came with briefcases and left without smiling. Diane moved to Richmond in 1997. She packed her watercolors, her easel, and 3 suitcases of clothing and left without saying goodbye to Agnes. She had never once, in 14 years, spoken to Agnes about anything other than where to put the clean towels. Edward died on a Sunday morning in March of 2004. Agnes found him in the parlor chair, his head tilted slightly to the left, his reading glasses still resting on the arm of the chair. The window was open. The last thing he had been looking at was the garden. She called the ambulance. She called Charles. She stood in the hallway while the paramedics came through. She did not cry in front of anyone. That night, alone in her small apartment in Barton, she sat on the edge of her bed and wept until her chest ached. After Edward's death, the house changed. Not slowly, immediately. Charles moved into the main bedroom, rearranged the furniture, replaced the curtains, and removed most of his father's personal items within 2 weeks. A cleaning company from Richmond came in to do a deep renovation of the ground floor. Agnes was told her duties would now focus only on the upstairs rooms and the kitchen. Her pay did not increase. Her hours did not decrease. But the way Charles spoke to her shifted. Not into cruelty exactly, but into a kind of hollow indifference that made it clear she was no longer a person in this house. She was a function. She stayed because she needed the work. Her son Michael was in community college. The apartment cost more each year. Her savings were thin, and her body was beginning to tell her things she did not want to hear. For the next 14 years, Agnes continued to clean the Whitfield mansion. She watched Charles cycle through 3 different business ventures, each one louder and more desperate than the last. She watched the estate slowly deteriorate as maintenance was deferred, repairs postponed, and sections of the house closed off to save on heating costs. The greenhouse collapsed entirely in 2012. The garden went wild. The carriage house roof began to leak, and no one fixed it. In 2018, the collapse finally came. Charles had leveraged the estate in a series of development deals that fell apart when the market turned. Creditors filed claims. Legal notices appeared in the mail almost daily. Agnes knew, because she was the one who carried the envelopes inside and placed them on the desk, that Charles no longer bothered to sit at. One morning in September, Charles came downstairs carrying a suitcase. He did not look at Agnes. He walked past her as though she were a piece of furniture, opened the front door, and said without turning around, "The house will be locked up by the end of the week. Your services are no longer needed." Agnes stood in the hallway holding a dust cloth. After 35 years? Charles stopped on the front steps. For a moment, she thought he might say something human. Instead, he pulled out an envelope and held it toward her. Inside was a check for 2 weeks of pay. No severance, no thank you, no acknowledgement that she had spent more years inside this house than he had. She took the envelope. Charles got into his car and drove away. Agnes locked the front door behind her with the key she had carried for 3.5 decades. She placed the key on the hook inside the kitchen door where it had always hung. Then, she walked down the gravel driveway, through the iron gate, and onto the road that led back to town. She did not look back. Not because she did not care, but because looking back at something you love while it is being taken away is a pain she had already learned to avoid. The next 5 years were quiet in the way that slow erosion is quiet. Agnes found part-time work cleaning offices in Barton. Her son had moved to Norfolk and called every Sunday evening. The apartment grew smaller each year, not in its actual dimensions, but in the way a place shrinks when there is no life in it besides your own. And sometimes, late at night when sleep would not come, she thought about the door. In November of 2023, Agnes was 68 years old. She had been retired for almost a year, forced out when her back made it impossible to work a full shift. Her pension was small. Her savings were almost gone. Michael sent money when he could, but he had his own family now, a wife, 2 young children, and a mortgage that pressed on him the way mortgages always press. On a Tuesday morning, Agnes drove past the Whitfield estate for the first time in years. She had taken a longer route home from the pharmacy because the main road was closed for construction. The iron gate was rusted open, hanging crookedly on one hinge. The driveway was covered in dead leaves and broken branches. Through the bare trees, she could see the mansion, its windows dark, its shutters hanging loose, its stone facade stained with 5 years of neglect. She pulled the car to the side of the road and sat looking at it. Something in her chest shifted. Not a decision exactly, but the removal of something that had been holding a decision in place. She drove home. The next morning she came back. She parked outside the gate and walked up the driveway on foot. The front steps were cracked but solid. The front door was not locked. The latch had corroded and the door pushed open with a hard shove. Inside, the hallway was dark, cold, heavy with the smell of damp plaster and old wood. Leaves had blown in through a broken window and lay in a dry carpet across the floor. Agnes walked through the ground floor slowly. The kitchen was stripped. The library shelves were empty. The parlor chair was gone. Everything that could be sold had been sold. Everything else had been left to rot. She climbed the stairs. The upstairs hallway was darker than she remembered, the ceiling stained where water had come through the roof. She passed Diane's old painting room, now bare. The linen closet, door hanging open. At the end of the corridor, the oak door stood exactly as it had always stood. Closed. The brass knob was green with oxidation. Agnes reached into her coat pocket and took out a small ring of keys she had kept in a drawer beside her bed for 5 years. She had gone back for them 2 days after leaving, slipping through an unlocked side entrance before the estate was sealed. She tried 3 keys before the 4th one turned. The lock resisted, then gave way with a sound that seemed too loud for the empty hallway. The door opened inward. Agnes pushed it slowly. The hinges groaned. A wave of stale and closed air rolled out, carrying a smell she had not expected. Not decay, not dust, but the faint scent of old paper and dried ink, and something like cedar. The room was not large. It was perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a single window that had been covered from the inside with a heavy curtain, now faded to a pale grey. Beneath the window stood a wooden desk, its surface covered in a layer of fine dust. Against the left wall was a tall filing cabinet with 4 drawers. Against the right wall, a bookshelf filled not with books, but with labeled boxes and file folders arranged in a careful order. Agnes pulled the curtain aside. Weak November light fell into the room. She turned back to the desk. On the desk surface, beneath the dust, lay a leather-bound folder. She opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a copy of Edward Whitfield's last will and testament, dated January of 2003, 1 year before his death. She read it slowly, her eyes moving down each paragraph with the careful attention of someone who had spent a lifetime being precise. The will stated that upon Edward Whitfield's death, the Whitfield estate, including the house, the surrounding 42 acres, and all physical contents not previously allocated, was to be held in a trust for a period of 20 years. At the end of that period, full ownership would transfer to Agnes Elaine Morrow, in recognition of 4 decades of faithful service, personal integrity, and devotion to the preservation of this home and its memory. Agnes read the paragraph twice. Then she sat down in the desk chair and read it a third time. Beneath the will was a second document, a letter in Edward's handwriting. The paper had yellowed, but the ink was still clear. Agnes, if you're reading this, then enough time has passed, and perhaps enough things have gone wrong, for this room to finally be opened. I locked this room because I knew my son. I knew that if he found these papers before the time was right, he would destroy them. I knew that if he understood what I intended, he would use every tool available to him to undo it. I have watched you care for this house for more years than I can properly repay. You did not do it for money. You did not do it for recognition. You did it because you understood something that neither of my children ever learned. That a house is not a possession. It is a responsibility. This estate is yours, not because I am giving it to you, but because you are the only person who ever truly kept it. Agnes set the letter down on the desk. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the surface and waited until the trembling stopped. She opened the filing cabinet. The first drawer contained copies of the trust documents, notarized and filed with the county recorder's office. The second held financial records showing Edward had set aside a separate account for the maintenance of the estate during the 20-year trust period. The third contained correspondence between Edward and a lawyer in Staunton named Philip Ware, who had handled the trust arrangement independently from the family's regular attorneys. The fourth drawer held a thick brown envelope marked personal, not for estate counsel. Inside were more letters from Edward to Agnes, never sent. Dozens of them, spanning years. Some were short, some filled multiple pages. They spoke about the house, about the garden, about the way she had kept things alive when everything around him was slowly failing. One letter, dated the Christmas before he died, ended with a single line. You were the best part of this house, Agnes. I am sorry I never said so while I still had the courage. Agnes closed the drawer. She sat in the room that had been locked for 40 years and let the silence hold her. Outside, a cold wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, the dust on the desk had been disturbed only where her hands had touched it. She stayed for more than an hour. Then she gathered the documents, placed them carefully into the leather folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked back down the corridor, down the stairs, through the empty hallway, and out the front door. The next morning, she drove to Staunton. Philip Ware's law office was still operating, now managed by his daughter, Catherine, who had taken over the practice after her father's retirement. Catherine was expecting her, not because Agnes had called ahead, but because a provision in the trust had triggered an automatic notification to the office when the 20-year period had expired 3 months earlier. Catherine Ware was a woman in her late 40s, direct in speech, careful with documents. She confirmed everything. The will was valid. The trust was intact. The separate maintenance fund had been partially depleted by property taxes over the years, but still held enough to cover immediate repairs. The county recorder's office had the original filings. The transfer of ownership could proceed as soon as Agnes signed the acceptance paperwork. Agnes signed in a slow, steady hand. Catherine looked at her across the desk when it was done. My father always said Mr. Whitfield's greatest fear was that his children would destroy the house before you could save it. Agnes folded her copy of the documents into the leather folder. He was nearly right. She began, the next week. Michael drove down from Norfolk on Saturday with his truck and spent 2 days helping her clear the worst of the debris from the ground floor. The broken windows were boarded temporarily. The front door was fitted with a new lock. The kitchen was cleaned, the old stove tested and found still functional. The water line was restored after a plumber from Barton spent an afternoon replacing a corroded valve beneath the house. Agnes did not move into the mansion immediately. She came each day from her apartment, arriving at 7 out of a habit so deeply ingrained it no longer required thought. She swept the hallways. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. She cleaned the windows one by one until the light came back into rooms that had been dark for 5 years. The work was hard. Her back protested every evening. Her knees swelled, but she did not stop. She had cleaned this house for 40 years. She knew its bones better than anyone alive. She knew which boards to step on, where the drafts came in, how to seal them. By the end of the first month, the ground floor was livable. She moved in on a Friday afternoon, carrying 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen supplies into the small room behind the kitchen, the same room where she had once eaten her lunch alone for decades. Word spread through Barton the way it always does in small towns. The woman who had cleaned the Whitfield house was living in it now. Some people raised their eyebrows. Others nodded, as though they had always expected something like this, as though a house that had been cared for by the same hands for 40 years would eventually find its way back to those hands. Earl Dawkins, who ran the hardware store, began setting aside supplies for her at a discount. A retired electrician named Frank Hodges came up one afternoon and rewired the second floor without being asked, saying only that he owed Dorothy Morrow a favor from 30 years ago, and figured this was close enough. A woman named Martha, who worked at the Barton Library, brought a box of books to fill the empty shelves. Agnes accepted everything with the same quiet steadiness she had always carried. She did not make speeches. She did not celebrate. She simply continued cleaning, repairing, restoring, and slowly bringing back to life a house that had been left to die. By spring, the garden was being cleared. Agnes followed the old layout as best she could remember it, cutting back the overgrowth, uncovering the stone paths. The roses had survived on their own, tangled and wild, but still blooming in pale pink and deep red along the south wall. Michael came back for a weekend and helped her repair the greenhouse. By May, she had seedlings growing inside, herbs and flowers she remembered from Edward's time. She opened the front rooms to visitors on Saturday mornings, not as a formal event, just an open door. People came to walk through the restored hallway, to sit in the parlor where new curtains hung in the same pale green as the originals. Agnes served tea from the kitchen. She did not charge anything. She simply let people in. A retired history professor from Charlottesville heard about the house and drove down to see it. He spent an afternoon examining the architectural details and told Agnes the house was one of the finest surviving examples of mid-19th century estate architecture in the region. Agnes looked at him. "It deserves to be lived in." The letter from Charles Whitfield's attorney arrived on a Wednesday in June. Agnes found it in her mailbox in Barton, a thick envelope with a Richmond return address. She opened it at the kitchen table, read it through once, then set it down and made a cup of tea before reading it again. The letter stated that Charles Whitfield was contesting the validity of the trust and the transfer of ownership. His attorneys argued that Edward Whitfield had not been of sound mind when he executed the trust documents, that the arrangement had been made without the knowledge or consent of the legal heirs, and that Agnes Morrow, as a former employee, had exerted undue influence over an elderly man in declining health. Agnes brought the letter to Catherine Ware the next morning. Catherine read it without any visible change in expression. "This is exactly what my father predicted," she said. "He told Edward it would happen. That is why the trust was set up the way it was, independently, with a 20-year delay, and with documentation so thorough that challenging it would require challenging the entire county notarial record." "Can he win?" Catherine set the letter down. "He can make noise, he can delay, he can try to exhaust you financially, but the legal foundation is extremely solid. My father was a very careful man. He knew the kind of people he was protecting you from." The hearing was scheduled for late August. Agnes spent the weeks before it the same way she spent every other week, working on the house. She repainted the porch railing. She replaced the broken step on the rear staircase. She cleaned the chandelier in the dining room, piece by piece, standing on a ladder for 3 hours until every crystal was clear. On the morning of the hearing, she wore a dark blue dress she had bought for Michael's high school graduation 20 years earlier. It still fit. She drove to the courthouse in Staunton with the leather folder on the seat beside her. Charles was already seated when she entered the room. He looked older than she expected. His hair had thinned. His suit was expensive, but did not sit on him the way expensive suits once had. Beside him sat 2 lawyers. Beside them sat Diane, who had come from Richmond for the first time in years. She did not look at Agnes. Catherine presented the documents in order: the original will, the trust agreement, the notarized filings, the maintenance fund records, the correspondence spanning 7 years of careful planning. Charles's attorney argued that the trust had been executed in secrecy, that the family had never been informed, that the relationship between Edward and Agnes suggested manipulation. Catherine placed on the clerk's table one final document, a letter from Edward Whitfield to the county recorder, dated 6 months before his death, stating clearly in his own handwriting that the trust had been created freely and without coercion. He wrote that he had observed his son's financial recklessness for years and believed the estate would not survive under his management. He wrote that Agnes Morrow was the only person he trusted to preserve what he had spent his life building. The judge, a man in his 60s, read the letter in silence. He looked up at Charles. He looked at Agnes. He asked Charles's attorney whether he had any evidence beyond speculation that Edward Whitfield had been mentally incapacitated at the time the documents were signed. The attorney said they were requesting additional time to gather medical records. The judge denied the request. The trust documents had been filed, notarized, and unchallenged for 20 years. The transfer of ownership was lawful. The case was dismissed. Charles left the courtroom without speaking. Diane followed him. At the door, she paused and turned back toward Agnes. For a moment, it looked as though she might say something. Then she turned away and walked out. Agnes sat in the courtroom for a few minutes after everyone else had left. Catherine touched her shoulder and asked if she was all right. Agnes nodded. I spent 40 years in that house believing I was just the help. You were never just the help. Agnes looked at the folder in her lap. He knew that. He just waited too long to say it out loud. That evening she returned to the mansion. The late summer light poured through the clean windows and lay in long golden rectangles across the restored floors. The garden was blooming. The greenhouse was full of green. The front door stood open, letting the warm air move through the hallway the way it had when the house was young. Agnes walked upstairs to the east corridor. She stood before the oak door, now permanently open, the room inside aired out, the desk polished. On the desk she had placed a framed photograph of Edward Whitfield sitting in his parlor chair, looking toward the window. Beside it, a small vase of roses from the garden. The same pale pink variety his wife had planted decades ago. The same ones Agnes had kept alive long after everyone else had stopped noticing they were there. She touched the edge of the frame with her fingertips. Then she turned and walked back downstairs to the kitchen, where the kettle was already beginning to whistle and the evening light was settling over the countertop and the house was breathing around her the way it always had. Steady, familiar, and finally, completely hers. Outside, the last light of the day moved slowly across the hillside and the old stone walls and the iron gate that now stood straight on its repaired hinges. The driveway was clear. The garden was in bloom. And the mansion that had once been abandoned by the people who owned it was now being kept by the person who had always loved it. Not because she had been given permission, but because some things do not need permission to belong where they belong. If you stayed with this story until the very end, thank you for being here. If it moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, or simply let me know you were here. And if you want more stories like this, stories about loyalty, quiet strength, and justice that arrives when it is least expected, subscribe to the channel. The next story might be the one that finds you at exactly the right moment.